Hello, guys, and welcome to another series of lessons that we are starting, and we call this Sentence Structure Series. So, in this series of lessons, we're going to be learning how to write good sentences. So, these are the topics we're going to cover: types of sentences, simple sentence, special forms of sentences, run on sentences, fragments, sentence expansion, relative clauses, noun clauses, and the last one is going to be parallelism. So, in this particular lesson, we're going to cover the different types of sentences. Let's get started. So, we have four different types of sentences: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. But before we talk about them, let's talk about something very important, something very foundational. Because if we don't understand clauses, then we won't be able to understand the differences among these sentences. So, what is a clause? Basically, a clause is a group of words. Yeah, very simple. But it's not complete. It's not just a group of words, but they are a group of words that has a subject and a verb. So that's what a clause is. Let's look at some examples. I am going outside. So this is a clause because you have a subject I and a verb am going. Outside, of course, is preposition. After we ate dinner. This is also a clause because your subject is we and your verb is ate. Ate what? Dinner. So you have the direct object there. Because it rained. Again, subject it, verb rained. Seoul is a huge city. So our subject is Seoul and our verb is. It's a be verb. So that's how simple clause is. Now, for the sake of comparison, I want you to look at these other groups of words. Going outside. So this is not a clause because, first of all, you don't have a subject, right? And you also don't have a verb. Why? Going outside. Going is not a verb here because you don't have a be verb. Yeah, this is what we call a gerund, which we're going to be learning later on. After eating dinner. So you also have the preposition after, but the same. You don't have a subject and you don't even have a verb. Eating is not a verb, it's also a gerund. Because of the rain. So you don't have a subject and you don't have a verb. Seoul, a huge city. So you can see something like this in titles, right? And this is not a clause because you don't have a verb. So if this is not a clause, what do we call this? These are phrases. So phrases are groups of words. Yes, just like a clause, but they don't have a subject and a verb. So we have different kinds of phrases. We have prepositional phrases after eating dinner. We have gerund phrases and many more. I won't go into details, but later on we'll talk about that. Anyway, I just wanted you to see the difference between a clause and a phrase. Okay, now we can separate our sample clauses into two kinds of clauses. So we have independent clause and dependent clause. So when you say independent, that means it's like an adult. It can stand on its own, right? What I mean, it can stand on its own is if you read it, I'm going outside. It makes sense, right? I can understand what you're trying to say. So it has a subject, it has a verb, and it also has a complete thought. Seoul is a huge city. Yeah, it can stand on its own. That's why we put a period right there because it makes sense. I can understand what you're trying to say. But if you look at dependent clause from the word itself, dependent, that means it's like a baby. So it needs an adult all the time. All the time. Even when the baby is sleeping, she needs an adult, right? For supervision. She needs an adult to for food. It cannot stand or she cannot stand on her own. Just like these clauses, sorry. After we ate dinner. So if a person tells you, for example, in a conversation, after we ate dinner, what would you say? Yeah, that's right. You would just say, "What? What did you do? What are you trying to say?" After we ate dinner, yeah. So the what the person is saying does not make sense, even though there is a subject and a verb, but it doesn't have a complete thought. It's like something's missing. What? Complete your sentence. Or if a person says, "Because it rained." What? So yeah, you're trying to give a reason because it rained, but reason for what? But if you say, "Oh, we didn't play soccer because it rained." Oh, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So a dependent clause would not make sense unless you attach it to an independent clause. Okay, now let's look at these examples and try to identify if it is an independent or dependent clause. I highly encourage you to pause this video right here so that you can try the exercise for yourself. Okay, so let's look at the first one. If you like music, if you like music, uh, so what are you trying to say? This is dependent. This is a dependent clause because it's not complete. It's a condition. But condition for what? Second, when you're ready. Okay, when you're ready. What's that? What are you trying to say? So this is also dependent. It needs to be attached to an independent clause for it to make sense. Number 3, we arrived. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you arrived. Now, you might say, you didn't say where. Well, it's not necessary. Maybe the person you're talking to already knows where you arrived, so you don't need to state where it is. But you have a subject and a verb, and it makes sense. So, makes complete sense. Therefore, number 3 is independent. Before you go, number 4. Before you go, so what? What should I do? So it's not complete also, right? Therefore, it is dependent. Farming is risky. Yes, that makes sense. So it's an independent clause. What he wants to eat. Okay, now this one may pass for an independent clause, right? After all, it's a question. And question is a sentence. It's it makes complete sense. It has a complete thought. But did you notice that the way it is grammatically structured does not make it a question? It's actually a noun clause. If it's a question, it should be, what does he want to eat? So therefore, this is dependent. Number 7, this test is hard. This also is independent. It makes sense. Number 8, why should I learn English? Now this is a question. And if it's a question, then it is an independent clause. Okay, now, how do you distinguish between independent and dependent clause? The first thing is you need to ask yourself, does it make complete sense? Does it have a complete thought? Like if you try to separate it from the rest of the sentences you have, does it make sense? Yeah, so that would be the first test. The second test is look at the beginning of these clauses. If it begins with a subordinating clause, if, when, before, because, and many more, when, the subordinating clauses, right? Then it's dependent and it needs to be attached to an independent clause. And if it begins with WH questions, then you have to figure out if it is a question or if it is part of a sentence. So we'll learn that later on. How do we distinguish between a question and a noun clause? So number 8 is a question. Why should I learn English? If you want to make it a noun clause, it will become why I should learn English. Number 6 is not a question, it's a noun clause. If you want to make it a question, it will become what does he want to eat? Okay. Now let's try to complete our dependent clause so that they will make complete sense. So if you like music, you should learn an instrument. Now it's complete. Now it has a complete thought, right? Number 2, when you are ready, we will leave. Okay, that makes sense. Number 4, so before you go, check the lights. Number 6, I don't know what he wants to eat. So you can see now that these dependent clauses make complete sense only when they are attached to an independent clause. Okay, now that we have a clear understanding of what clauses are, let's move on to the different types of sentences. So we have 4: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. A simple sentence has only one independent clause. A compound sentence has 2 or more independent clauses. And a complex sentence has 1 independent clause and 1 or more dependent clauses. And finally, a compound complex sentence has 2 independent clauses and 1 or more dependent clauses. Now, can you imagine how they look like? I bet not. So let's look at some examples. So a simple sentence can be as simple as the book is long. The book is a subject and is your subject, is your verb. And a compound sentence, the book is long, but I finished it quickly. So you have two independent clauses. The book is long and I finished it quickly. And you join these independent clauses using coordinating conjunctions or fanboys. Do you still remember what fanboys are? Yeah, you should have memorized it by now. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. In a complex sentence, the book is long since it covers many topics. So you have one independent clause, the book is long, and one dependent clause since it covers many topics. So you can see that we used a subordinating conjunction since. So you can already see the basic difference between a compound sentence and a complex sentence. So compound sentences use coordinating conjunctions and complex sentences use subordinating conjunctions. And finally, the book is long since it covers many topics, but I finished it quickly because it was so interesting. So this is an example of a compound complex sentence. A compound complex sentence has two independent clauses. So can you identify the two independent clauses here? Yeah, the book is long is the first one, and but I finished it quickly is the second one. And you also have dependent clauses. So in this case, we have two. The first one is since it covers many topics. And that one is connected to our first independent clause. It gives a reason why the book is long. And the second one is another reason because it was so interesting. But this time it gives a reason for our second independent clause. So in a compound complex sentence, you should use a coordinating conjunction or a subordinating conjunction. Actually, not or, and. Coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. Okay, let's look at them in detail. Here is our sample sentence. For simple, Allison visited the museum. Yeah, you can see that a simple sentence can be very short. So you have the subject, you have the verb, visited, and you have the direct object. I'll be making a separate video that's next in our series about the different ways you can write a simple sentence. But for now, I just want to show you that it's not always short. In fact, a simple sentence can be very long. Let's see how that happens. I can add another subject, Allison and Mark. Actually, it's not another subject, it becomes a compound subject. We call that a compound subject. You still have one subject, but this time it's compound. Two persons, Allison and Mark. And you join those persons into one subject using and. So you also have that option. And I can also make it a compound verb. So visited and bought. So you have a compound subject and you also have a compound verb. But you can see that we only have one set of subject and one set of verbs, which still makes it a simple sentence. Or I can also add some extra details, like we're talking about some books. Books for what? Books for their project. So I added a prepositional phrase for their subject. Prepositional phrases are phrases that start with a preposition for their project. And I can also add an adverb of time to answer the question when. When did Allison and Mark and visit the museum and bought some books? Sorry, when did Allison and Mark visit the museum and buy some books for their project? Yesterday afternoon. So I can also include an adverb of time, and also I can include another prepositional phrase, project in what subject, in their science class. So you can see that a simple sentence can be long. But what makes it simple is not because it's short, but because it only has one independent clause. It only has one subject and one verb. Okay? Now let's look at a compound sentence. So a compound sentence has two or more independent clauses. Let's go back to our examples. But this time, let's separate them. Okay, this time Allison visited the museum and Mark bought some books. So they did certain things differently. Now, let's combine them using and. Allison visited the museum and Mark bought some books. So, what is and? Well, and as you know, is a coordinating conjunction. It's one of the fanboys. For and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. This is something you should memorize because it's special. This is a special set of conjunctions. As you can see, there is a comma before these conjunctions. Whenever you use them, you need to use a comma before them. And they're specifically used for compound sentences. But another way to write a compound sentence is through a semicolon. Allison visited the museum. Mark bought some books. So you can see that two independent clauses are being joined by a semicolon. Now, this is a special case because not all the time you can do this. You can only do this if you think your readers can clearly see the relationship between your sentences, even without a conjunction. I would suggest that you don't use this often because you want to make it clear to your readers the connection between your sentences. But this is an option. So these are two ways you can write a compound sentence. Actually, there is another way. If you look at our definition or parameters for a compound sentence, two or more. How can you write three or more? But I'm not going to show you that right now because I'm just trying to give you an overview of the different types of sentences. We will do that much later, okay? But you can see that you can also expand them just like what we did in simple sentences, our simple sentences earlier. So you can add an adverb of time, yesterday afternoon, and of course prepositional phrases. Alright, we are done with the first two types of sentences. And what we can see so far is that both of them have independent clauses and independent clauses only. They don't have any dependent clause. And let's look at how different they are going to be from our last two types of sentences. So the third one is a complex sentence. What makes it complex? So first, it has a independent clause. Of course, it should have one independent clause because all sentences have at least one independent clause. I hope you figured that out by now. And aside from the independent clause, it has one or more dependent clauses. Let's look at an example. So Allison visited a museum, so that's one independent clause. And another independent clause, Mark bought some books. Now, in order to make this a complex sentence, I have to introduce, I have to make one of them a dependent clause. And how do I do that? Allison visited the museum after Mark bought some books. So now we have one independent clause and one dependent clause, and we were able to join them by using a subordinating conjunction after. So do you remember what our subordinating conjunctions are? We have because and since for reasons, although, even though for opposition, if, unless, condition, when, while, before, after, time, so that, purpose, whereas, for comparison, contrast. Now, there are many of them. There are more than this list that we have here. If you want to review them, then please visit the video, watch the video I made about connecting words. I'll put the link in the description below. But so far, we can see that we have one independent clause. Allison visited the museum, so it is independent because it can stand on its own. If I separate it, if I drop the other part of the sentence after Mark bought some books, it will still make sense. Allison visited the museum, right? Yes, it has a subject and a verb and a complete thought, so that makes it an independent clause. But we also have the second part, which is a dependent clause. It cannot stand on its own. Yes, it has a subject, it has a verb, and it has but it doesn't have a complete thought. So if someone tells you after Mark bought some books, you're gonna say what? What? What's next? What's the next thing you're gonna say? Because that is not complete. It doesn't make sense. Yeah, so that's probably what you're gonna say. And one more way to figure that out is by looking at the beginning of the sentence. It begins with, sorry, the beginning of the clause, not the sentence, because it is not a sentence. It starts with after, right? After Mark bought some books. So that's how you figure out if it is a dependent clause or an independent clause. Okay. Now, another way we can write a complex sentence is by using relative clauses. Look at this example. Allison visited the museum after Mark, who is her groupmate, bought some books. So our relative clause here is who is her groupmate. So why is it a relative clause? Well, first of all, why is it a clause? Because you have a subject, who, and you have the verb is. Okay? And it's a relative clause because it starts with a who. So that's what relative clauses are. They start with a who, which, that, and many more. We're going to talk about that more in details. And by this clause, I'm trying to describe Mark, which is the subject or a noun. Now, what do you call something or a group of words or a word that describe a noun? That's right, adjective. So relative clauses are also adjective clauses because they describe a noun. Okay, I want to show you another example. So let's say I want to describe books. What are these books? What are these for? So I added another clause, relative clause, which are for their science project. So the subject is which and the verb is are. So you have how many clauses now? Yeah, you have one. Allison visited a museum, and another one after Mark bought some books, and another one who is her group mate, and the last one which are for their science project. In other words, we have, sorry, I'm too advanced. In other words, we have one independent clause and three dependent clauses, which fit our parameters, right? Because you can have one or more dependent clauses. So, being able to write a complex sentence means that you will be able to include extra information or vital information in your sentences smoothly. Because that's one big problem of English learners. They try to include a lot of things in their sentences, and there's no problem with that, except that they do it incorrectly. So when you want to do that, if you want to do that, that's okay because you can't write simple sentences all the time, right? Your sentences, your essay, your paragraphs will be boring if it's all simple sentences. That's why you need to use complex sentences, but understand that you have to do it in a correct way. And the last one is compound complex sentence. So when it comes to compound complex sentence, we have two independent clauses and they are joined by fanboys or a semicolon and one or more dependent clauses. Basically, you can have unlimited dependent clauses. Okay, let's look at this example again. So let's use this as our base. Let's say that you want to add some more details. You want to expand this sentence for whatever reason. Allison visited the museum after Mark bought some books. So, how do we make this a compound complex sentence? How do we make this longer legally, correctly? Okay, this is what we can do. So, we added a subordinating conjunction after. Now we can add a coordinating conjunction. Yesterday afternoon, Allison visited the museum after Mark bought some books. So today, they are finishing their science project. So we can see that we were able to add another independent clause using a coordinating conjunction so. So you can see that a compound complex sentence, that's so easy to see, right? From the name itself, has a combination is a combination of compound sentence and a complex sentence. That's what it is. So you have the best of both types of sentences. And believe me, you would want to master how to write this sentence because you need to include information, details when you write sentences. And this is how you do it. Okay, let's analyze it. So we have two independent clauses. Allison visited the museum. And you also have, so today they're finishing their science project. So we call them again independent because they can stand on their own. They're like adults. So if I just read them, Allison visited the museum, that makes perfect sense. And the other one as well. And we have one dependent clause after Mark bought some books, which of course doesn't make sense on its own. It needs to be attached, connected to an independent clause. And just that's what we did. It's just exactly what we did. We attached it to Allison visited the museum. Now let's say that I want to add another detail, another dependent clause in this sentence. a relative clause because I want to explain, or not really explain, I want to give further information about this science project. So I can add a relative clause which is due tomorrow. So now I have two dependent clauses. Sorry, my tongue is getting tied talking about independent and dependent clauses. So I added another dependent clause which is due tomorrow. And you can do that. You can add more dependent clauses as much as you like, as long as, okay, let me emphasize this, as long as they are correctly added. Okay? So they need to be connected to an independent clause, and at the same time, you need to use the relative pronouns correctly, and of course, the subordinating conjunctions. So there's no stopping you from doing that as long as you can do them correctly. However, did you notice that we only have two independent clauses? Now, if you look at other grammar books, they're going to tell you that a compound complex sentence has two or more independent clauses. So why am I writing just two? Because I think it's safer for English learners, English language learners like you, to stick to two independent clauses. When you become more, I would say, when you become better in writing sentences, then you can expand your sentences by adding more independent clauses. So that's one reason. Another reason is you don't want to make your sentences too long. So a rule of thumb is you can use just one of the fanboys in a sentence. If you go beyond that, then that means you're making your sentence too long. So if you're going to add another independent clause, why don't you just start another sentence? So that's my personal opinion as an English teacher. It's not the only way to go. You can do that, but for the sake of practice, I would say that at this stage, just write two independent clauses, okay? But you can, again, write more dependent clauses, as many as you want. And that's it for our types of sentences. This is the first lesson in our series of sentence structure lessons. And as I said, as I've always been saying before, in English, use it or lose it. So I'm giving you an assignment. Your assignment is to find two sentences for each type of sentence that we discussed. That means you should give me 8 sentences. You can use any English book. I highly recommend the Bible because it uses different types of sentences. So that's one good place for you to find them. And of course, if you can write your own sentences for each type, that would be awesome. All right. I'll see you in the next one. God bless you.